says, and then what do you think it says about cities? So over to group one. What do we learn from Genesis 11?
Well, we had the Tower of Babel, so it was this idea of people coming together to create community, but the flaw in that was they were trying to make a name for themselves. So we thought it showed some good things about cities, like people's capabilities to build and create, and people's desire for community, but then the reason God confused them was that they weren't looking to Him for their identity, they were trying to make a name for themselves.
That's right, exactly. Thank you, that's very helpful. So Tower of Babel, a mixture of things that are positive, draw out of that about creativity and imagination, I suppose, but also that self-seeking, self-serving view of the city. It's fantastic, thank you. Over here, what do we have? In Joshua 20.
Yeah, we had the cities of refuge. So when having settled in the lands, God set aside a number of different cities. The idea being that if you unintentionally killed someone, it happens, that you've got somewhere, and I guess a member of the person's family wants to avenge what you've done, there's somewhere safe to go to. So it kind of represents cities as a kind of community. You go to the gates and present yourself there, and then you're given a place to stay with them. So there's the community. There's a sense of security in the city. I guess also in times of war, one perhaps flees the city as well. So a sense of security, but also a sense of justice as well. So there's you present yourself to the council or something, and then you would stand trial and so on. So there's a kind of fair process to work through what happened and what the just response to that would be, and time to cool off.
To prevent sort of like, vengeance killing and things like that. Yeah, so really, that's a really helpful summary. Thank you very much. So cities as a place of refuge, of protection, and of justice. That's great. Okay, over here. So group 3.
We had lots of people being carried off to exile in Babylon. And we had some very original thoughts on this, which was it was about being rooted in the city and contributing to it. And while we talked briefly about this last night, so we got some kind of homework done for us then. But we thought, while their initial thought might have been, we're exiles, we should resist, they actually get told to root themselves there and seek the city's flourishing, be committed to that city.
Yes, they engage in being good citizens, working together.
Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And then the Babylon over here was perhaps slightly different. What did you pick up from your passage?
I think we were sort of a bit torn about, so this is Babylon in Revelation, so not generally a good thing. But
strap line.
But a lot it does sort of have parallels with Jerusalem, because there's precious stones and great wealth and good things, but there's this kind of element of corruption in it, and there's human beings sold as slaves, and then there's the fact that it will just be destroyed within an hour and just laid to ruin despite being a great city. So this is the transience of the city.
Yeah, so no lasting value there. So a place of corruption, although some perhaps glittering beauty and something to draw people to it. Great, thank you so much. And then finally, group 5, what's your city?
So it was talking of something that we're anxiously awaiting, like a beautiful bride. It alluded to the gates always being open, which was said that could have to do with safety, So you would lock the gates because it's unsafe, but in the city you don't need to because it's safe. The permanence of it, whereas cities are quite fast moving, they evolve a lot, it's never changing, never ending. God's at the center of it, providing the light. We also talked about if it's the case that for every square inch more image of God is in the city, it's probably also true about pain and suffering and those sorts of things. And it talks about how all the tears will be wiped away and there will be no more mourning and that sort of thing. So
It's wonderful, thank you. So the New Jerusalem is a place of comfort and peace and so on, and eternity as well. That's great. So we have these two tales of two cities, don't we? These two contrasting perspectives of the city in the Bible. The city is a place that houses a terrible injustice, corruption, self-serving, squalor, and sin. The anti-God city. And then the city is a place of hospitality, of peace, of righteousness and justice, of prosperity and human flourishing, and a place which is part of God's plan. So I thought what we could quickly do is just whiz through looking at these two narratives. So first of all, cities as places of corruption. So if we want to follow this track, put your chairs back down. The first time that cities are mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis 4, and it's in the context of Cain leaving and moving to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. And it says Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he built a city and named it after Enoch. It says before that, Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. So the sense in which the idea of cities is being introduced as being places away from the presence of God. And it's obviously Cain being sort of like the champion for the first city doesn't really give it a good feeling about it. It's a consequence of Cain's murderous act that he builds a city. So cities are introduced in the Bible as a sign of arrogant rebellion against God. And then that's confirmed in the next reference, which is in the Tower of Babel, where it's constructed. Then we have Sodom, and then we have Gomorrah. So, cities at this point not getting a great track record. And then Abraham is called in Genesis 12, and he's called out of Haran, that city where he was dwelling, to lead a pilgrim people of God. So he's called away from the city in order to fulfill God's will, out of these sort of settled urban existence to become a nomad. The next kind of reference is God's people enslaved in Egypt, whereas the city is a place of industry, but it's also a place of oppression, and God needs to rescue them from that. Walter Brueggemann says, Israel's founding story concerns emancipation from urban practices of exploitation. And then we see examples of godlessness in the cities into which the Israelites are exiled, Babylon being the prime example. And then that name is adopted in Revelation as a symbol of evil and idolatry, and probably representing Rome, a place where Christians were being persecuted at the height of persecution. So it's understandable why some Christians around the world have idealised instead the pastoral, the rural idyll as being a place where God really dwells. If you think, if you take it to its extreme, you think about the Amish people shunning technology, living a life that's traditional and rural-based in order to remain close to God. And there can be a fearfulness, therefore, of the corruption that city life can bring. Well, of course, there's an alternative reading, isn't there? So the alternative reading says something like that. Cities are a place of flourishing. Eden's not intended to stay as a rural idyll. The intention is for Eden to be cultivated, to be subdued and developed, for Eden to actually be developed into a city. So the development of cities is actually participating in God's plan for humanity. In Hebrews 11 it says this, "For he looked forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." Abraham was not sent from Haran simply to wander, but his exit from the city was a sign of a greater calling to construct the city that was to come. And we have that very positive take in Joshua 20, where God instructs Joshua to build cities of refuge as places of justice and of mercy, of protection and peace, where lawlessness is kept kind of behind the gates. And then we come to sort of the centerpiece in the Old Testament, if you like, of the construction of the temple, the place where God is going to dwell in the city of Jerusalem. And that reflects that sort of the parallel between that place of the actual physical place of Jerusalem and the place where God dwells sort of in the heavenly sense becomes connected with sort of an urban view. So we have things like Psalm 46 saying this: "There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God is in the midst of this city; it shall not be moved. And then great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. Within its citadels, God has shown himself to be a sure defence." So we have these enduring images in the Old Testament of the city being a place where God is living, where God inhabits. And then in the New Testament, Jesus expands this to say that actually he calls his followers a city on a hill. Us, as the followers of Christ, we have become part of this population, of this flourishing city. Hebrews 13 says this: "Jesus suffered outside the city gate in order to sanctify the people by his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp and bear the abuse that he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come." The punishment that Jesus faced was to go outside the city, to go outside the city walls, to the place of lawlessness, so that we might be set free from the law. And then, of course, we finally come to Revelation 21, the holy city. It's not built from scratch, but it's a picture of that development from the Garden of Eden, with that river running through it, being faithfully cultivated into the place, into a city. So we have the city as a sign of judgment, and the city as a sign of promise. And Paul uses the analogy of Hagar and Sarah in this. Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the other woman corresponds to the Jerusalem above. She is free and she is a mother. So that constant contrast between Babylon, the sort of actual and metaphorical, and Jerusalem, the old and the new, runs through the whole narrative of the Bible, illustrating the distinction between cities that are around self-worship and around the worship of God. And Augustine's City of God is kind of the key text that really explores this. He says the humble city is the society of holy men and women and angels. The proud city is the society of wicked men and evil angels. The one city began with the love of God. The other had its beginnings in the love of self. So what? How do we respond to these tales of two cities? How do we live in between these two worlds? Well, I think we have two kinds of postures that we can take. I think we have a posture that to engage in the certain hope that the new city is breaking into the old. God's kingdom is coming, and we want to engage in bringing hope into the old city and the corrupt city that we see around us, just like those in exile in Babylon wanted to do that. But in order to engage in the city, to bring hope, to plant hope, to uncover hope, that's kind of a wrestling and challenging task. And so we also need to retreat as well, and to be restored and to find sanctuary with God. So we have two postures that I want us just to explore: engaging in hope and retreating to find sanctuary. I wonder if some of you need a little bit of refreshment. I'm just going to pass around some little toffees to keep us going. It's, the theology is going to kick in a bit more, and then we're going to engage in some creative practices in a moment. So the paints are coming, but in the meantime, when I grab a toffee. So, what does it mean to engage in hope in the city? Kierkegaard says this: hope is a passion for the possible. Hope is a passion for the possible. Hope is not escapism. It's not a fantasy about the future. It's possible to incarnate hope in our city, in London. The new Jerusalem in the midst of the worldly city. Here's the chunkiest of my quotes for this morning, so just listen up to this one. This is a bit of Jürgen Moltmann. He says this: "To believe means to cross in hope and anticipation the bounds that have been penetrated by the raising of the crucified. In this hope, the soul does not soar above our veil of tears to some imagined heavenly bliss, nor does it sever itself from the earth. Hope causes not rest but unrest, not patience but impatience. It does not calm the unquiet heart, but it is itself the unquiet heart in humanity. Those who hope in Christ can no longer put up with reality as it is, but begin to suffer under it and to contradict it. That we do not reconcile ourselves, that there is no pleasant harmony between us and our reality, is due to unquenchable hope. This hope makes the Christian church a constant disturbance in human society, seeking, as the latter does, to stabilise itself into a continuing city." I wonder if that rings true for you in your life in London at all. That sense of impatience, that sense of wrestling, a sense in which there is not a pleasant harmony, that actually we can have an unquiet heart because we are seeking something that is beyond. I think there's an encouragement in that for all of us who are weary and still wrestling with the tensions of living in a city where there is so much possibility and yet there is so much suffering around us. Hope can be restless. It's not ready to settle for the world as it is. It's constantly seeking the world as it could be. So when the prophet Jeremiah calls for the Israelites to seek the welfare of the city, to live faithfully in the fallen city in which they find themselves, they're called to live out an alternative, hopeful city within the earthly city in which they find themselves. And it is a struggle. We are aware that our citizenship is in heaven, and yet we're called to live that out in the here and now. Walter Brueggemann says this: "Israel's faith offers an alternative narrative of the city. The conventional narrative of the city is a thin tale of acquisitiveness and scarcity that produces violence. That tale is so often well told, and it seems a given, but it is not. It's the task of the church to tell an alternative account of our city." Well, I think that requires imaginative inquiry. It requires us to use our imagination. What does this city, what does London, what does Hackney, what does Dalston look like through these lenses of hope? What does it mean to live out the city that is to come within the broken city that we find ourselves actually dwelling in? What does it mean to live out on earth as it is in heaven, the hopeful within the broken, the transcendent within the imminent, within the here and now? It requires us to really stretch the sort of muscles of our imagination, if you like. So I wonder what signs of hope and life you have in your community, where you live, where you work, where you worship. What are the signs of hope that you have around you? Or what are the signs that you have seen, things where stories of hope have come into being? And what are the signs of hope that actually they're just like little flickers in your imagination at the moment you would love to see breaking through? I'm just going to share with you a little story, just a couple of little examples from Shadwell, and then you're going to do this for yourselves in Dalston. So a couple of stories that actually are historical, that I think for me are stories of hope breaking into the present. This is a mural on the road where I live, on Cable Street. It's a mural of the Battle of Cable Street, which happened in 1936. Got some of you will have know about this. So it's when Oswald Mosley, with his the fascist black shirts, wanted to march through the East End of London and drive out the Jewish people who were living there, saying this would, enough of this. It's very sort of prescient story, isn't it? Seems very relevant to today. And what happens? The East Enders, those from the local churches, those from the local synagogues, just regular EastEnders rose up in resistance and said no to this story. This is the broken story of racism and hatred to the outsider being stood up against by ordinary people who refuse that and said, no, actually we have a more hopeful city. We have a hopeful city of where there is integration, where people can love one another, where people can love their neighbour. And although there was some immense police brutality in bringing down that riot, they were not able to march through the whole of Cable Street. So it's a sign of hope. And I think just last Monday, we were out giving out these stickers to commuters in Shadwell Station. Love London, no place for hate. After all the horrible rise in racism since the referendum, members of my church were, I'm sure members of your church may have experienced the same thing. I'd actually personally had racially abused on the Friday after the result came out. And so we said, no, we're not going to stand for this. We have a more hopeful city than that. So we were there on Monday giving out information about how to report hate crime and giving stickers to people about saying, actually, we stand for love in this city. Anyway, it's a little snippet of a sign of hope in the community. So my question to you is, what are the stories, the symbols, the pictures, the signs of hope in Dalston, in Hackney, where you live? And rather than just making this an intellectual exercise, this is going to be a creative exercise. So you've got 10 minutes. You can do this in pairs, you can do it on your own, you can do it in groups, to think of what are the stories of hope, things that might have happened, things that are currently coming into being, or just a hope that you have for the future. And there are some little artist materials. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to ask people to feed back their stories of hope. If you are a poet, you can write a poem. If you're like, this is totally not my thing, I'm hating this idea that you're telling me to do this, you can just write down 6 bullet points, that's fine. No worries at all. If you enjoy painting, there are paints at the back, there's felt tips, there are some pictures, you could make a little collage if you want. Whatever you like. If you want to write a song, there's a guitar, I can write a song about hope in the city. Where can you see it? Okay, 10 minutes. Please go and get creative, and then you'll have an opportunity to feed back in 10 minutes.
Oh.